the city of angels and demons. To understand how a police officer becomes a gangster with a badge, you first have to understand the soil in which that corruption grew. The setting is Los Angeles, mid-1990s. The city was a powder keg that had already exploded once. The 1992 riots, sparked by the acquittal of the officers who beat Rodney King, had left physical and psychological scars across the metropolis. The Los Angeles Police Department, also known as the LAPD, was viewed by much of the populace not as protectors, but as an occupying army. In response to the spiraling violence and the crack cocaine epidemic tearing through neighborhoods, the LAPD doubled down on a specific strategy: C.R.A.S.H, Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums. C.R.A.S.H units were elite. They were the tip of the spear. Officers assigned to these units were expected to be aggressive, proactive, and tough. They rolled into gang territories in unmarked cars, wearing plain clothes or modified uniforms, tasked with making life hell for gang members. But in the Rampart Division, located just west of downtown LA, one of the most densely populated and violent square miles in America, the C.R.A.S.H unit evolved into something else entirely: Rafael Pérez.
Born in Puerto Rico and raised in Philadelphia, Pérez joined the LAPD in 1989 after a stint in the Marines. By 1995, he had been assigned to the Rampart C.R.A.S.H unit. Physically, Pérez was imposing: tall, muscular, charismatic, and handsome. He walked with a swagger that commanded the room. He was the kind of cop rookies wanted to be and criminals feared. But beneath the surface, Pérez was a man who had begun to blur the lines. In the insular culture of Rampart C.R.A.S.H, the motto was unofficially, "The ends justify the means." If you knew a guy was a gang member, it didn't matter if he was innocent of the specific crime you were arresting him for. What mattered was getting him off the street. Pérez found a kindred spirit in his partner, Nino Durden. Durden was younger, eager to impress, and quickly fell under Pérez's influence. Together, they became the kings of the street. They didn't just police the gangs, they began to act like one. By 1996, the corruption was systemic. Reports later surfaced that C.R.A.S.H officers were awarding themselves plaques for shooting suspects. They wore tattoos of a skull with a cowboy hat and poker cards, the dead man's hand, symbolizing their lethal power. They held parties where they drank and celebrated their dominance over the neighborhood.
Pérez and Durden were at the top of this food chain. They developed a routine: stop gang members, shake them down, steal their money, and confiscate their drugs, not to book into evidence, but to keep. But on an October afternoon in 1996, their arrogance would lead them to commit a crime so heinous it would eventually bring the entire department to its knees. The shooting of Javier Ovando. It was October 12, 1996. Pérez and Durden were on patrol, cruising through the decaying streets of the Rampart district. They were supposedly on a stakeout, monitoring a specific apartment complex known for 18th Street gang activity. They zeroed in on a 19-year-old named Javier Ovando. Ovando was a gang member, uneducated, and barely spoke English. To Pérez and Durden, he was a nobody, a statistic waiting to happen. They had harassed him before, but today the boredom and the power trip coalesced into something darker. According to later testimony, the officers stormed the apartment. There was no warrant, there was no probable cause. They banged on the door, and when they gained entry, they grabbed Ovando. The details of what happened inside that room are chilling. They handcuffed the teenager. At this point, Ovando was subdued. He was defenseless. He was in the custody of the law. But something snapped, or perhaps it was premeditated. Pérez and Durden drew their service weapons. With Ovando restrained, they opened fire.
Bang, bang, Bang! Bang! 4 shots rang out in the small apartment. Ovando was hit in the chest, hip, and head. The silence that followed must have been deafening. The officers looked at the bleeding teenager, realizing he wasn't dead, but he was gravely injured. They had just shot an unarmed, handcuffed man in cold blood. In any other profession, this would be the end, but Pérez and Durden were masters of the frame-up. They immediately went into damage control mode. The script was one they knew by heart, a script used by corrupt officers for decades, known as a throwdown. Nino Durden reached into his supply. They were carrying a weapon they had confiscated weeks earlier during a different arrest, a snub-nosed semi-automatic rifle with a serial number filed off. They wiped it down and placed it on the floor next to the bleeding, paralyzed body of Javier Ovando. They uncuffed him, removing the evidence of his restraint, and called it in. "Shots fired! Officers needs help!" When backup arrived, the story was ready. Pérez claimed that they had been using the vacant apartment as an observation post when Ovando burst in, brandishing a rifle, intending to kill them. Pérez claimed he shouted, "Gun! Gun!" and that they fired in self-defense to save their own lives. The blue wall of silence held firm. The responding supervisors saw the gun on the floor. They saw the hero cops. They saw the wounded gang member. The narrative was set. Ovando miraculously survived, but the bullet that struck his spine left him paralyzed from the waist down. He would never walk again. The tragedy didn't end in the apartment. It moved to the courtroom. Ovando was charged with 2 counts of assault on a police officer and 1 count of exhibiting a firearm. The trial was a farce. On one side, you had Rafael Pérez, articulate, handsome, wearing his crisp LAPD uniform, testifying with the confidence of a man who believes he is untouchable. On the other side, you had Javier Ovando, a paralyzed teenage gang member in a wheelchair who required a translator. The judge and jury didn't hesitate. They believed the badge. Ovando was convicted and sentenced to 23 years in prison. Back at the station, Pérez was treated as a hero. He had survived a shootout. His supervisors applauded his bravery. It seemed like the perfect crime. They had silenced a witness, put a bad guy away, and boosted their own reputations. The road rage catalyst. For a year, it seemed like the corruption in Rampart would go on forever. Pérez and his cohorts were invincible. But the unraveling of the Rampart scandal didn't begin with Pérez. It began with a road rage incident involving another officer, which pulled at a loose thread that would eventually unravel the whole sweater. The date was March 18, 1997. Frank Laga, an undercover narcotics detective, was driving his unmarked Buick Regal. He had just finished a dangerous operation. As he stopped at a red light in North Hollywood, a Mitsubishi Montero pulled up alongside him. The driver of the Montero was Kevin Gaines. Gaines was an LAPD officer, specifically a crash officer, but he was off duty. He was also allegedly associated with Death Row Records, the rap label run by Suge Knight, which was notorious for hiring off-duty LAPD officers as security. Neither man knew the other was a cop. According to Liga, Gaines stared him down. Words were exchanged. Gaines shouted, "I'll cap you." Liga, fearing for his life, pulled away when the light turned green. Gaines chased him. The pursuit wove through traffic until they hit another light. Gaines pulled a gun. Liga, a seasoned narc, didn't hesitate. He drew his 9mm service pistol and fired twice through his own window into the Montero.
Gaines was struck in the heart and crashed into a gas station. He died at the scene. When the dust settled, the LAPD was in shock.
An undercover white officer had killed an off-duty black officer in what initially looked like a racially motivated road rage incident. The media frenzy was immediate. However, as Internal Affairs, IA, dug into Kevin Gaines' life to investigate the shooting, they found disturbing connections. Gaines lived a lifestyle that his police salary couldn't support. He drove expensive cars, wore designer clothes, and had deep ties to the very gangs he was supposed to be policing. And who was one of Gaines' closest friends in the department? Rafael Pérez. Investigators began to look at the circle of friends surrounding Gaines. They found a clique of officers who partied together, worked together, and seemingly broke the law together. This group included Pérez, Durden, and another officer named David Mack, who would later be arrested for robbing a Bank of America of $722,000. The LAPD formed a special task force. They weren't sure what they were looking for yet, but they knew something in the Rampart division smelled rotten. Part 4. The Hubris and the Bisquick. Despite the heat turning up on his social circle after Gaines' death, Rafael Pérez felt invincible. He had gotten away with attempted murder. He had sent an innocent man to prison for 23 years. He was the king of the streets. By 1998, Rafael Pérez and Durden weren't just shaking down dealers. They were full-blown traffickers. They would seize cocaine, book half of it or none of it, and sell the rest through connections on the street. But on March 27, 1998, Pérez made a mistake born of pure arrogance. He needed money. He walked into the LAPD property division, the heavily guarded room where evidence is stored. He signed out 6 pounds, roughly 3 kilograms of cocaine. The cocaine had been seized in a previous case and was being held as evidence. Pérez claimed he needed the drugs for a court case. The property officer handed it over. Pérez didn't take it to court. He didn't take it to a lab. He took it, and he replaced the cocaine with a powdery baking mix, specifically Bisquick, hoping that if anyone glanced at the package later, it would pass a visual inspection. It was sloppy. It was reckless. It was the act of a man who no longer feared consequences.
But Internal Affairs was watching. They noticed the discrepancy in the logbooks. The court case Pérez claimed to need the evidence for didn't exist. When they tested the returned substance, the lab results came back. It wasn't cocaine. It was pancake mix. On August 25, 1998, the trap snapped shut. Rafael Pérez was arrested. The mugshot taken that day shows a man who still can't quite believe he's been caught. He is still in his uniform, the very symbol of the authority he had abused for years. Initially, Pérez played it cool. He thought he could beat the charges or get a slap on the wrist. But the prosecutors weren't playing games. They were looking at him for the theft, for distribution, and they were digging into his past cases. They were threatening him with decades in prison. Pérez, ever the survivor, looked for a way out. He realized that the only commodity he had left was information. He knew where the bodies were buried, literally and metaphorically. On September 8, 1999, Rafael Pérez struck a deal. In exchange for a reduced sentence of just 5 years for the cocaine theft, he agreed to plead guilty and, more importantly, to sing. He promised to expose the corruption within the C.R.A.S.H unit. What followed was one of the most explosive confessions in American law enforcement history. Over thousands of pages of transcripts, Pérez laid it all bare. He detailed the us versus them culture. He described the throwdown weapons. He admitted to the shooting of Javier Ovando. But he didn't just implicate himself and Durden. He implicated 70 other officers. He told investigators, "We are the ones who decide who walks and who stays. We own the streets."
He described a unit that operated like a mafia. He told them about the drinking, the beatings, the perjury. He estimated that 90% of the officers in the Rampart crash unit were in the loop regarding the framing of suspects. They would draft false police reports together, rehearsing their lies so their stories would match in court.
The story of Rafael Pérez was too dark, too dramatic, and too cinematic to remain solely in legal textbooks. It seeped into the cultural consciousness of America. Screenwriter David Ayer grew up in South Central LA and watched the scandal unfold. When he wrote Training Day, he channeled the spirit of the Rampart C.R.A.S.H. unit into the character of Alonzo Harris, played by Denzel Washington. While Alonzo is a fictional amalgamation, the parallels are undeniable. Alonzo drives a Monte Carlo, similar to the cars favored by C.R.A.S.H. officers. He wields two guns, Smith & Wesson 4506s, the same unauthorized carry style used by some Rampart cops, and he operates with total impunity, ruling the neighborhood through fear and extortion. Denzel Washington's Oscar-winning performance captured the terrifying charisma of Rafael Pérez, the idea of a cop who believes that to catch the wolves, he must become a wolf. The famous line, "King Kong ain't got nothing on me," echoes the hubris Pérez displayed right up until the moment the handcuffs clicked. Grand Theft Auto: San Andreas, 2004. 3 years after Training Day, Rockstar Games released San Andreas, set in a fictionalized version of 1992 Los Angeles, Los Santos. The game's primary antagonist is Officer Frank Tenpenny, voiced by Samuel L. Jackson. Tenpenny is practically a direct translation of the Rampart ethos into a video game. He leads a corrupt anti-gang unit, C.R.A.S.H., in the game. He forces the protagonist, CJ, to do his dirty work. He frames people, works with rival gangs, and causes riots. The game's storyline even ends with Tenpenny facing trial for racketeering and corruption, only to be acquitted, sparking citywide riots, a mirror of the tensions in LA during the 90s. The story of Rafael Pérez is a cautionary tale about power. It demonstrates how quickly the line between lawman and criminal can vanish when oversight disappears and a culture of ends justify the means takes over. Pérez started as a man sworn to protect the city. He ended up costing the taxpayers millions, paralyzing an innocent man, destroying the public trust, and becoming the blueprint for the ultimate movie villain. He wanted to be a legend on the streets of Los Angeles. In a twisted way, he got his wish. He became a legend, just not the kind he expected.